Welcome to Life Stories. In a quiet town on the outskirts of Rockford, an elderly widow named Margaret Thompson runs a small gas station, carrying the memories of her late husband, a decorated war hero. But when a ruthless biker gang threatens her peace and desecrates his legacy, Margaret makes a call that changes everything. What follows is a gripping tale of honor, loyalty, and the power of standing together against intimidation. Will justice prevail? Will Margaret find the strength to fight back? Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey of courage and redemption. The quiet outskirts of Rockford, Illinois, had always been a peaceful place. The kind of town where people nodded in greeting, took their time at the diner, and where the past was cherished like an old, well-worn quilt. Margaret Thompson had lived here for decades, tending to her small gas station with the same care she once used to mend soldiers' wounds. She was a woman of quiet dignity, silver-haired and steady, with hands that had known both the delicate touch of nurturing and the firm grasp of resilience. To the townsfolk, she was simply Miss Margaret, the kind old lady who still ran Thompson's gas station long after most would have retired. But there was more to her than met the eye. Margaret was the widow of William Thompson, a decorated World War II veteran who had fought with unshakable bravery, and Margaret had been by his side not as a passive observer, but as a battlefield nurse, risking her life to save the wounded, to hold the hands of dying men, and to whisper words of comfort in the middle of chaos. Inside her small gas station, at the front window, stood a framed display William's old uniform, pressed and immaculate, medals pinned to the breast. It was her way of keeping his memory alive, a tribute to a man who had given everything for his country. That evening, as the sun cast long shadows over the station, Margaret was finishing up for the day, wiping down the counter and humming softly. Outside, the last few customers pumped their gas and drove off, leaving the station bathed in the warm glow of the overhead lights. It was peaceful, as it always was. Then, the ground rumbled. It was faint at first, just a distant vibration in the soles of her feet. Then it grew louder, the unmistakable sound of motorcycles roaring in unison. Margaret stepped outside, shielding her eyes from the glare of the setting sun. A group of bikers rode into the parking lot, their machines gleaming under the light, chrome and steel reflecting like cold fire. There were at least a dozen of them, their leather jackets adorned with the insignia of a vulture with outstretched wings, the Iron Vultures. Margaret had heard of them, a notorious gang known for causing trouble, for intimidation, for making places like Rockford tremble under the weight of their presence. The leader dismounted first, a tall, burly man with a jagged scar running down his cheek. He walked with the slow, deliberate gait of someone who enjoyed making others nervous. His name was Bullied, and he was the kind of man who wielded power not through wisdom or respect, but through fear. Well, Bullied drawled, his voice edged with amusement. What do we have here? Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and met his gaze without flinching. Good evening, gentlemen. Can I help you with something? Bullied smirked, glancing past her to the framed uniform in the window. His eyes darkened. That yours? She folded her hands in front of her. It was my husband's. A murmur went through the group, the sound low and mocking. One of them, a wiry man with a missing tooth, stepped forward and pressed his face against the glass, giving an exaggerated salute. Bet it's just for show, he sneered. Probably never even saw real action. Margaret felt the heat rise in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. He fought bravely, she said firmly, and I'd appreciate it if you showed some respect. Bullied laughed, the sound deep and sharp like the scrape of metal on stone. He stepped closer, towering over her, his breath reeking of cigarettes. Respect is earned, lady, he said. And right now, I don't see much worth respecting. The others chuckled, their laughter filling the air like the growl of distant thunder. Margaret's heart pounded, but not out of fear, out of something deeper. Anger. This was her home, her husband's legacy. She would not allow these men to tarnish it. She turned on her heel and walked inside, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the old rotary phone behind the counter. There was a number she hadn't dialed in years, but one she had never forgotten. It was written in faded ink on the back of a photograph tucked in a drawer, the number of Tom Harrison, one of William's surviving squadmates. She lifted the receiver and dialed. The line crackled. Then a deep voice answered, gravelly with age but firm as ever. "This is Tom." Margaret swallowed. "Tom, it's Margaret Thompson." A pause. Then the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. "Margaret, what's wrong?" She glanced out the window. The bikers were still there, rifling through the trash cans, knocking over the displays. Blade had his back turned to her, but she could hear his voice. Taunting. Laughing. "It's some bikers," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "They're causing trouble at the station." She hesitated, then forced herself to say the words. "They disrespected William's uniform." Silence. Then Tom's voice. Low and cold. "They what?" Margaret closed her eyes. "I didn't know who else to call." "You did the right thing," Tom said. There was a rustling on the other end. The sound of movement. "Sit tight, Margaret. We'll be there soon." Margaret hung up the phone, her heart pounding, not with fear, but with a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And outside, the distant roar of motorcycle engines began to rise again. This time, it wasn't the iron vultures. This time, help was coming. Margaret stepped outside once more, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. The iron vultures were still there, their laughter grating against the silence of the town. Blade leaned lazily against his motorcycle, flicking a cigarette to the ground and crushing it under his heavy boot. His eyes met hers, and he smirked. The kind of smirk that belonged to men who had never been told no in their lives. "Back already, Grandma," he drawled. "Figured you'd be hiding inside." Margaret didn't answer. She simply stood there, her hands folded in front of her, steady as a mountain. She had spent years on battlefields where the air smelled of blood and gunpowder, where the groans of the wounded mixed with the distant thunder of artillery. This was not her first time facing down something terrifying. Blade tilted his head. "Curious. You got something to say?" Margaret glanced down the road, her heartbeat steady but expectant. She heard it before she saw them first. A low rumble, like the rolling of distant thunder. Then it grew louder, a chorus of deep, powerful engines approaching in the night. The sound echoed through the streets of Rockford, filling every alley and space between buildings. It was a sound that carried weight, a sound that meant something. The iron vultures straightened. Some turned their heads, frowning. Blade's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly masked it with indifference. The first headlight came into view. Then another. Then dozens. The veterans had arrived. They came in a formation so tight, so disciplined, that it was clear these were not just a group of older men out for a ride. These were men who had moved in unison through war zones, who had known what it meant to trust the person beside them with their life. Their motorcycles gleamed under the streetlights, their jackets bearing patches of honor, loyalty, and valor. At the front of the pack was Tom Harrison. He was older now, his silver beard framing a face carved with lines of experience. But there was nothing weak about him. He rode with the confidence of a man who had faced the worst the world had to offer and had lived to tell the tale. Blade's fingers twitched at his side, but he quickly covered it up with a laugh. Well, what do we have here?" he mused, stepping forward. Tom killed the engine of his bike and swung his leg over, landing on the pavement with a solid thud. He didn't speak right away. He simply looked at Blade. And in that moment, something shifted. Blade was a leader of bullies, men who thrived on intimidation and fear. But Tom was different. Tom had been forged in war. "You boys picked the wrong widow to mess with," Tom finally said. His voice quiet but carrying the weight of iron. Blade rolled his shoulders, feigning amusement. "That so?" He glanced around at his gang, searching for confidence in their faces. Some of them looked less sure now, shifting uneasily as they took in the sheer presence of the veterans before them. Tom took a slow step forward. "You think respect is something you take?" His voice was calm, deliberate. "You think honor is something you can spit on?" He motioned to the window where William Thompson's uniform had once stood, and his eyes darkened. That uniform belonged to a man who earned his place in this world. A man who fought for something bigger than himself. Blade scoffed. But there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "And what? You're here to teach us a lesson, old man?" Tom didn't react to the insult. He had heard worse. "We're here to make sure you understand something real clear," he said. "This town, this station, not yours to intimidate. You don't have power here. You don't have fear. You have nothing." The Iron Vultures exchanged glances. Some of them were starting to realize what Blade refused to see: they were outmatched. Not in brute force, but in something much greater. Tom's men didn't posture. They didn't need to. Their presence alone spoke louder than threats ever could. They had lived through wars, had stood their ground when everything around them had crumbled. A gang of bullies on motorcycles wasn't going to shake them. Blade's jaw tightened. His instinct was to fight, to reassert dominance. But deep down, he knew. He could feel it in the way his men hesitated, in the way the veterans stood without fear. Finally, he let out a sharp breath and threw up his hands. "Fine. We're leaving," he said. But his voice was tight with bitterness. "But this ain't over." Tom didn't reply. He simply watched as the gang mounted their bikes one by one. The Iron Vultures peeled out of the parking lot, their tires kicking up dust, the roar of their engines fading into the night. Silence fell over the gas station. Margaret let out a slow breath. Tom turned to her, his expression softening. "You okay?" She nodded, though there were tears in her eyes, tears not of fear, but of gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you." Tom gave her a small, knowing smile. "You don't have to," he said. "William was one of us. And we take care of our own." Margaret stepped forward and embraced him, her frail arms wrapping around a man who had just brought hope and protection when she needed it most. But even as the moment settled, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Blade had meant what he said. And Margaret knew that trouble had a way of coming back when you least expected it. For the next few days, things were quiet at the station. Too quiet. Margaret went about her daily routine, filling up tanks, wiping down the counters, and chatting with familiar faces. But there was a lingering tension in the air, a silence that felt unnatural, like the stillness before a storm. The veterans kept their word. Every night, they took turns patrolling the area. Tom had set up a rotation, making sure someone was always nearby. Margaret felt safe with them watching over her. But deep down, she knew the Iron Vultures weren't done. Blade wasn't the type to let things go. And then, one morning, Margaret woke up to find the past few days of peace shattered. The moment she stepped outside, her stomach dropped. The glass display window at the front of the station, the one where William's uniform had been displayed, was shattered. Shards of glass littered the ground like jagged ice. But that wasn't the worst part. The uniform was gone. Margaret stood frozen for a moment, staring at the empty space where her husband's legacy had once been. Then, her gaze moved to the wall beside it. Her breath caught in her throat. A message had been spray-painted in bold, dripping letters. "This is just the beginning." Her hands trembled, a deep ache blooming in her chest. Not from fear, but from anger. William had fought for his country, for the people he loved. He had earned that uniform with sweat, blood, and sacrifice. And now, these men, these cowards, had stolen it like it meant nothing. Margaret turned on her heel and went inside. her fingers pressing the familiar numbers on the phone. The line barely rang before Tom's voice came through. "What happened?" She exhaled sharply. "They took it. Tom. William's uniform. And they left a message." A beat of silence. Then the quiet, controlled fury in his voice. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." When Tom arrived, he wasn't alone. Half a dozen veterans rolled in behind him, their faces hard as steel. They didn't say much as they surveyed the damage. They didn't need to. The quiet way they moved, the way their eyes darkened as they looked at the message on the wall, it spoke louder than any words ever could. Tom ran a hand over his beard, his jaw tight. "They're trying to bait us." Joe, one of the veterans, scowled as he kicked a piece of broken glass aside. "They want us to react. They want to fight." Margaret folded her arms, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to spill over. "Then what do we do?" Tom turned to her, his expression unreadable. "We fight back." She frowned. "I don't want violence, Tom. I just want William's uniform back." Tom nodded. "And we'll get it back. But we do this our way. Smart. Not on their terms." Joe grinned. "Which means we make sure they never get another chance to pull a stunt like this again." For the rest of the morning, the veterans worked tirelessly. They installed security cameras, motion sensors, and reinforced the windows. They made sure that if the iron vultures tried anything again, they wouldn't just be seen, they'd be caught. Margaret watched them, feeling something she hadn't in a long time: hope. But while she and the veterans prepared, Blade and his gang were making plans of their own. Miles away, in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, the iron vultures gathered. The stolen uniform hung over the back of a chair, the medals still gleaming in the dim light. Blade sat with his boots propped up on a table, a cruel grin stretching across his face. "Bet they're panicking right now," he mused, flicking open a lighter and watching the flame dance. "Bet that old lady's shaking in her boots." The gang laughed. But not all of them. Jake, the youngest of the group, shifted uneasily. His gaze flickered to the uniform, his stomach twisting. He had joined the Iron Vultures because he thought they stood for something: freedom, rebellion, brotherhood. But this felt wrong. "Maybe we should leave it at this," Jake muttered. "We proved our point." Blade's expression darkened, and he slowly leaned forward. "You getting soft on me, Jake?" Jake hesitated. "It's just," he glanced at the uniform again. "That belonged to a real soldier. Maybe we're taking this too far." The laughter died down. Blade stood up, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. He walked over to Jake, standing just inches away, his eyes burning with something dangerous. "Let me tell you something," he said quietly. "Nobody disrespects us and gets away with it. That old lady, those old war dogs, they think they won." His lip curled. "They haven't seen anything yet." Jake clenched his fists. But he didn't argue. He knew better. Blade turned back to the gang, his voice rising. "Tomorrow night, we finish this." He picked up a gas can, shaking it slightly. "We're gonna burn that station to the ground." A few of the men exchanged uncertain glances, but none of them spoke up. Blade had a way of keeping control, a way of making sure no one questioned him for long. Jake swallowed hard, his stomach knotting. He had a bad feeling about this. Night fell over Rockford, casting long shadows across the town. The gas station, now fortified like a small fortress, stood silent under the flickering glow of the streetlights. Margaret had locked up for the night, but sleep didn't come easy. She lay in her small apartment above the station, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak, every rustle of the wind outside. The veterans had set up a watch. Tom was the first on duty, his motorcycle parked just outside, a thermos of black coffee in his hand. He sat in a folding chair near the front of the station, his sharp eyes scanning the road. He'd spent too many nights in places far worse than this to let his guard down now. Margaret glanced at the clock. Almost midnight. She stood by the window, looking out over the quiet streets, the neon glow of the gas station sign casting a soft reflection on the pavement. A part of her wished she could believe that the worst was over, that the iron vultures had gotten their fill of trouble and moved on. But she knew better. Down below, Tom shifted in his seat, then reached for his radio. "Joe, you seeing anything?" A static-filled pause. Then Joe's voice crackled through. "Negative. All clear on my end." Tom exhaled slowly. "Stay sharp. I don't like how quiet it is." Margaret turned away from the window and pressed a hand against her chest, willing her heart to slow. She had lived through worse nights filled with the sounds of distant explosions, the cries of the wounded. But there was something different about this. Something more personal. Then, just as she turned toward the kitchen, she heard it. A low, distant rumble. Her breath caught in her throat as she rushed back to the window. Down below, Tom was already on his feet, his coffee forgotten. The sound grew louder, closer. More engines. More than before. Margaret's pulse pounded in her ears as she reached for the phone. Tom grabbed his radio. "Joe. Sam, get back here. Now." The headlights came first, piercing through the darkness. Then the figures, emerging from the night like wraiths. The iron vultures were back. And this time, they weren't here to intimidate. They were here for war. Blade dismounted his bike first, the gas can in his hand. His smirk was gone. There was no mocking laughter this time. Only cold, simmering anger. Tom didn't move. He stood his ground. His face calm, unreadable. But Margaret knew him well enough now to recognize the tension in his stance. The way his hands were ready, prepared. Blade tilted his head. "Evening, old man." Tom didn't answer. He just looked at him, silent, waiting. Blade stepped forward, holding up the gas can. "Nice place you got here." He let the can tip slightly, a slow trickle of gasoline hitting the pavement. Margaret's heart pounded as she gripped the phone tighter. Tom's voice was steady. "You don't want to do this." Blade's smirk twitched. "Oh, but I do. See, you humiliated me. In front of my boys. You made me look weak." His eyes darkened. "And I don't let things like that slide." A flick of his wrist. The lighter in his hand flared to life. And then, "Stop." A voice cut through the tension, sharp and desperate. "Jake." He stepped forward, his face pale, his jaw tight. He wasn't holding a weapon. He wasn't threatening. But his eyes, they carried something that hadn't been there before. Doubt. "You don't have to do this," Jake said, his voice firm, though Margaret could hear the nerves beneath it. "This isn't a fight we win." Blade turned, his face twisting with something between disbelief and fury. "Excuse me?" Jake took another step forward. "This isn't the way." Blade let out a laugh, but there was no humor in it. He shook his head. "You've gotta be kidding me." Jake didn't move. "That uniform we stole?" He turned slightly, looking at the other gang members. That wasn't just a piece of fabric. That was his life. A man who fought for something real. Something bigger than any of us. The other bikers shifted, exchanging glances. Blade's jaw clenched. "I don't care." Jake exhaled sharply. Then, before anyone could react, he stepped forward and knocked the lighter out of Blade's hand. The flame died instantly. For a second, nobody moved. Then, Blade lunged. Jake was ready. He dodged to the side, his foot sweeping out, knocking Blade off balance. The gang leader stumbled, barely catching himself. And then, Tom moved. It was fast. Too fast for Blade to react. In a single, swift motion, Tom grabbed Blade's wrist, twisted it hard, and sent him crashing to the pavement. Blade let out a grunt, struggling. But Tom pressed his knee into his back, keeping him pinned. Silence fell over the lot. The remaining iron vultures hesitated. Some looked ready to fight. Others, less so. Jake turned toward them. His hands still clenched into fists. "This is over." His voice was quieter now, but no less firm. "You all know it." Slowly, one by one, the gang members stepped back. And then, they got on their bikes. Without a word, they rode off, their engines fading into the night. Margaret let out a shaky breath, her legs weak beneath her. Tom pulled Blade to his feet, keeping a tight grip on his jacket. "You ever come back here," he said, his voice calm, deadly. "You won't be walking away next time." A moment later, the sound of sirens filled the air. The sheriff's car pulled up, its red and blue lights flashing across the gas station. Blade was still gritting his teeth, still defiant. But Margaret saw something else now. Fear. As the deputies cuffed him and led him away, Margaret finally let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was over. At least, she hoped it was. As dawn broke over Rockford, the gas station stood unharmed, a symbol of resilience. Of a battle won not just with strength, but with honor. The veterans remained for a while, reinforcing the bonds they had forged. While Jake, now free from the grip of the iron vultures, found a new path among men who understood the true meaning of brotherhood. Margaret stood at the station's entrance, watching the sunrise with quiet gratitude. William's uniform had been returned. But more than that, his legacy had been defended by those who still carried his spirit. Tom placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone, Margaret. We'll always have your back." And for the first time in a long while, she believed it. Subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales of courage, redemption, and the enduring power of human connection.